So 99% play Hugo wrong isn't a clickbait. It's a fact. So on day 1 of Hugo's release, pretty much all the guide out there got something wrong about Hugo, and it has to do with stun window mechanics. Even on the JP side and CN side got it wrong. So I do something that any sane person would do. I assume that I am wrong, and I spend half of my day thinking about why am I wrong, what am I missing out, and I look into my test on 20 days ago in the Hugo story mode, and it seems like I'm actually right. And I saw that the conclusion that I got in the test would have become a common knowledge at this point, but it doesn't. Out of all the Hugo's videos out there, there's only one video that I'm aware of that actually do it correctly, which is R2 speedrun. And if you want to listen to the conclusion right away, you don't want to use Hugo's chain attacks or any other person's chain attack twice. You want to use Hugo's Totalize, whether it's your skill or your ultimate, right after he used the chain attacks. And what I mean is, you want to cancel chain attacks and Totalize the enemy when the days meter is still flashing. But the focus of this video is going to be the general guide, so if you want to know why you don't want to chain attack twice in the Hugo's rotation, I will leave the timestamp down here at the #1 misconception. So, Hugo is the only DPS that could nuke a huge ass amounts of number without having a huge ass. If you have issue with Sunless Zone 0 or not having big enough damage per screenshot, Hugo will solve your mental illness instantly. I think the biggest numbers I see is about 6 million, if I remember it correctly. And his main source of damage are either coming from his skill or his ultimate, but you're gonna use it right after the enemy gets stunned. And this special mechanic is called Totalize. It's the special mechanics that would scale its damage based off the amounts of stun window times left, and it would consume all the stun window and end the stun state. But Totalize would inflict maximum of 25% of days to the enemy in the end. So the earlier you use Totalize, the bigger the number would be. And the following test would have some spoiler in 1.7 main story, but the main idea is the more you lose your stun window, the more damage you're gonna lose with Hugo. I would leave the timestamp so that you could jump to the part that has no spoiler. So as you can see from these videos on the left, if I Totalize at the end of the stun window, not only that the damage is low, I also get no days. And on the right side, it has 3 seconds of stun window left. I got some damage, but I only get 15% days after Totalizing the enemy. But if I use Totalize right after enemy gets stunned, not only that I would get a bigger number, it would also inflict 25% days to the enemy. And if I time my Totalize correctly, stun and Totalize the enemy in one go, I would get even more damage, because his damage is scaled with the amounts of stun window left. So you do want to use Totalize as soon as possible, or else you're gonna lose damage and the days. And the way it calculates its damage is that it has 1000% base damage, and the last 5 seconds is calculated as 1400% damage, and the remaining time would calculate it as 100% per second, up to 3400, which is a total of 15 seconds. So you definitely wanna Totalize the target before it reaches that last 5-second mark. And one thing you might be able to notice is that the Totalize damage from ultimate would be less than the skill Totalize damage, because ultimate has longer animation time, and the more time you lose, the more damage you're gonna lose. But overall, ultimate would deal 10 to 15% more damage than the skill, because it has its own separate damage multiplier. It doesn't just coming from Totalizing. But before you Totalize the target, generally you wanna buff yourself first with the Hugo chain attacks. It's gonna give you 12% crit rate and 25% crit damage, and you definitely don't want to miss that. But the second way to get the buff is to have Hugo stun the enemy. You could stun it with basic attack, you could stun it with ultimate or skill. It doesn't matter how you do it, he would also get the buff that way. And that is very important when you are playing him without Lycan, which is the advanced rotation that I'm gonna talk about later. Hugo's chain attack could group the mobs easily, And don't be afraid to use Totalize on the mobs, because it would refund some energy. For the best force set, I would recommend Hormone Punk's force set over the Woodpecker force set, because when you're playing with Woodpecker, you kind of have to slip in the basic attack before you use Totalize, and it would also waste the stun window. And Hormone Punk is just so much easier to get started with, and if you're playing Hormone Punks optimally, it is definitely better than Woodpecker force set. But if you already grind for Woodpecker force set, it is still a good option. And as for the best 2 set, you gotta go with the Woodpecker. Unless you could get above 100%, then you could choose crit damage or attack percentage. Ice is not recommended, because most of you are playing with Lighter and Lycan anyway. And as for his substat, you wanna get your crit rate up to 100%, 88% on the stat, 76% if you have Mindscape 1, then you follow with crit damage, attack percentage. This number 6 you wanna go for attack percentage, and for this number 5 is a little bit trickier, but I would highly recommend for the attack percentage. You don't wanna use ice percentage. If you're playing with Lycan and Lighter, you probably will, because both of them would give a loss of ice damage percentage, which gonna cause the stat saturation. And pen ratio is a no-no if you're playing him with his signature, or if you're playing Trigger with her signature. And again, it's because of the stat saturation. As for Wenjin, signature is not exactly a must pull if you have the following Wenjin, like the Alonjo one, NB01, and the Aveline one. And the rest of the numbers are looking like this. The best free-to-play choice is Mikado Desire, and it will also make you reach that 100% crit rate easier. Brimstone and Starlight Engine are viable but not good. So the best vertical investment for Hugo is to get a Lighter, then you get Lighter's signature, and then you get Hugo's signature, and then you proceed to get his Mindscape 1 and 2. And yep, you are watching Hugo's guide. So as for the team, there's this core passive on Hugo that allow him to increase his attack when he's pairing with Stunner. The first Stunner would give 300 attacks, and the second Stunner would give 600 attacks, which is equivalent to Lucy's buff. So yes, you do want to go with double Stunner. And one thing when you're playing double Stunner, I wouldn't recommend you to use Shock Star, because in double Stunner team, you would have too much days that you would benefit more from Proton Punks or even Astral Voice in some case. And if you're playing with Lycan, Swing Jazz force set on him is pretty much mandatory, cause he will always be the one that trigger the stun. The best in slot is gonna be Lighter Lycan team, and the Lighter trigger team seems to be on par with the Lycan team. And yes, you kind of wanna need Lighter when you are playing Hugo, and you could actually mix and match with any characters that I've listed here. They're all gonna work just fine, and it is listed in the order of power level. I don't particularly recommend Xingyi, cause double Stunner would deal so much days that Xingyi wouldn't be able to apply all the breaks multiplier. And I think Astra would probably performing at the same levels with Xingyi. Caesar is not recommended, but she's also fine. And for a free-to-play option, it's gonna be Paukra. Lucy is working surprisingly well because of her wombo combo with quick assist and the Astral Voice. Nicole is also working surprisingly well for the same reason. Koleda followed with Anbi. So now we understand Hugo's mechanics. So basically every second you wasted in the stun window is going to reduce Hugo's totalized damage. But one thing that people doesn't really know is that every chain attacks that you use wouldn't freeze the time. And most of the chain attacks animation would last about 1.5 seconds. Some of them could even goes up to like 2. But then wait, wouldn't chain attacks extend the stun window? Technically it does, but it doesn't last as long as you would think. I have it tested with this Pompeii here. Without triggering any chain attacks, I got 13 seconds here looking at the timers. And if I do one of this typical rotation, triggering stun with Lycan into chain attack with Hugo, I would get 14 seconds, as you can see from the timers here. And if I do this 3 full chain attacks, I'm gonna get 15 seconds. And there's this also better way of doing it, which is cancel chain attacks 3 times, and I also got 15 seconds. And keep in mind that using chain attack would usually last about 1.5 seconds, which is not the time that it freezed it. And every second that you'd lose in the stun window is damage lost to Hugo's Totalize. So the extra duration that you got from the chain attacks isn't justifiable enough to trigger all of them, cause you're risking yourself punishing yourself heavily for the minimal amounts of gain with a high risk of losing reducing damage, so there's absolutely zero reason to go for second chain attack unless you try to hurt your enemy less so it doesn't hurt its feeling. And the other assumption that I made that could be proven by the following videos is that even if Hugo triggered the totalization in the flashing state, his totalized damage would be calculated as full stun window time. In plain word, in flashing state, it lasts 13 seconds on Pompeii, but if Hugo totalized on that, his totalized damage would still count at 15 seconds. So let's take a look at the test that I've done 20 days ago. So as you can see here, I used this typical Lycan stun into Hugo chain attack and follow with Totalize and got 683k. And as you can see here, if I stun and totalize the enemy with one hit, it got 678k. But keep in mind that the last one was done with 235 damage multiplier, while this one was done with 200 multiplier. So the actual numbers in 200 multiplier would be 582k, which is about 15% less damage in totalizing. And I think this amounts of damage difference, it proves that totalizing the enemy in the flashing state would also benefit the full stun window time. And this is my thinking process. Feel free to pause it and relearn the middle school algebra. And yes, I do aware of Lider's passive that could extend 3 seconds, but it still doesn't justify the time you spend on chain attack. Like, why would you extend the time with longer time? And why would you extend more since Hugo's damage would only cap at 15 seconds? And I don't know how would this behave on the boss because I don't have Hugo to test it out. So it would be nice if somebody DMs me and let me test it cause I could test it right away. I know how to do this test, but I think this video has already proved enough. So based off my test, what you want to do is that you just want to stun the enemy with Lycan and chain attacks with Hugo into the skill, and that's really it. And the reason that you want to trigger the stun with Lycan is that he's gonna give 35% damage multiplier by hitting the enemy. So if you're playing Hugo without the Lycan, you could actually do one of these really cool tips that I've just shown you there. You gauge the amounts of days at about like 95%, and then you simply use skill with Hugo so that you could stun the enemy and totalize the enemy in one button and waste absolutely zero amounts of time on stun window. And this is some really advanced stuff that R2 has pulled off. That's why I said that he's the only one that get this right. So what he did is trigger the stun with Lycan and chain attacks with Hugo, nothing special here. But at this point, he canceled chain attack and used the skill before he swapped into Lycan and trigger another chain attack here. And it actually doesn't matter what he do next, and he follows up with Lider's chain attacks, wasting absolutely zero time with Hugo while dealing damage with Lider and Lycan. It's a pretty sweaty text if you're not dedicated to main Hugo. Anyway, I could prove my assumption immediately whether it's right or wrong, or if I'm lucky enough to have somebody actually lend me his account to play Hugo. Never mind, just before I wrap it up, I found videos that proves it. Even Linnu is down there commenting. I'm so nervous that he gonna get this tag before me. And I've been doing some account review recently. I have some pretty good time with the chat in the stream. So yeah, consider joining us if you happen to see me streaming. And that's about it. See you guys.